Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts.
The BP oil spill has made many Americans realize that we are not as well prepared for major environmental disasters as we should be. But oil spills are not just issues that impact coastal areas. In fact, here in Minnesota, there is a very real possibility of a spill. This month on Access, we talk with some of the people who are developing Minnesota's response plans to environmental disasters. Steve Lee manages emergency response to environmental accidents for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Steve, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Thank you, Jim.
Tell us more about your job and what kind of emergency situations you manage.
Pollution Control Agency, as you said, is involved with the environmental portion of spills and natural disasters and other sorts of incidents. Many of those incidents also pose very severe, significant threats to the public safety, the public health. So it's important that we work in concert with the local public safety responders, the companies that caused the spill and are responsible for cleaning it up, and the health authorities.
Tell us more about some of the environmental accidents that have happened in the past and how the MPCA has responded to those.
Some of the large incidents that have happened in Minnesota involve petroleum pipelines that carry crude oil from Canada and from the south to the Twin Cities refineries. Those pipelines are an extraordinarily safe way to carry petroleum, but when they do have a problem, it's a big problem. And we've worked a number of petroleum pipeline ruptures with the companies to make sure that they recover what they can and protect the public safety. A number of other cases have involved train wrecks with tanker cars of chemical or petroleum, or even commodity type things that can cause pollution. Same with truck wrecks. Gasoline tankers are a common situation where they're involved in an accident or rollover. But in some instances, it's things that people don't think about. A tanker load of milk, for example, spilled in the wrong place is a very, very biodegradable thing, which means it rots. So if it ends up in a pond or a stream and the milk rots, it takes all of the oxygen out of the water and can kill all of the fish life in that pond or that lake or stream.
Now that's something I don't think most of us would think about, because you think of milk as an organic product and you think, how can organic products be potentially hazardous? But they indeed can be, from what you said.
Crying over spilled milk, but it's a serious thing. If there's a tanker load of milk or ice cream or a load of manure, a big sewage overspill from a sanitary sewer system, those sometimes are some of the most environmentally serious spills we have. They don't pose much threat to public safety, but they're a very high environmental threat.
In the wake of the BP oil spill, obviously a lot of attention is being paid these days to the problems that would result from any kind of spill of oil. When we look at Minnesota, what are the areas of vulnerability? Any particular parts of the state that are more prone to oil spills?
Oil spills happen where there's oil, and that typically is where there's people. So it's the metro areas, the larger towns, the transportation routes, the railroad routes, and the pipeline routes. Those transportation routes, of course, cross Minnesota, and with our many, many lakes and moving waterways, that's always a hazard.
There are a couple of major refineries on the Mississippi River between Hastings and Red Wing. Is that a big area of potential concern for you?
A lot of the oil activity that goes on in Minnesota is, in fact, between St. Paul and the Hastings area. That's our two refineries, a number of pipelines cross there, other oil and asphalt storage areas, and some chemical facilities. So that's where we've put a lot of time and effort, along with the industries, in preparing for spills, because it is, in fact, not up to the public to prevent or clean up industry spills. It's up to the industry to prevent spills, be ready for spills they might have, and when they do happen, to do that cleanup.
There's been a lot of frustration over the BP oil spill. The government, the public, very upset that BP has not, in their estimation, done enough, quickly enough, to deal with the spill. Are the expectations that people have that this is something that can be quickly dealt with simply unrealistic?
I think in a lot of cases expectations are very, very high and oftentimes impossible to meet. The expectation we all ought to have is that companies that handle oil or hazardous substances do their utmost to prevent accidents, to be prepared for accidents, and then when they do happen, to aggressively do what they can do. But in moving water out in the big ocean, historically, if you get a 10 or 20% recovery, it's considered phenomenal. In Minnesota, if there's a spill on land or a spill to a pond or a lake, sometimes you can get a lot of that back. But if it's a spill to moving water, there really isn't the technology or the technique to get much of that back. This kind of a map shows a number of different things. For example, it says in this area there's a particular reptile that the natural resource folks believe is threatened, endangered, or of special concern. Similarly, up in this area, there's an area with a large number of nesting birds up in the trees here that requires special consideration in oil spill response. In other places, there are facilities. This icon means that that's a facility that stores oil. Another facility with oil storage. This map identifies the managed lands by the National Park Service or the Department of Natural Resources. It identifies this red line, for example, is a petroleum pipeline that crosses the river in this location. And probably most important for the oil spill responders are these green icons. Each of these icons is a location where oil spill responders and contractors and industrial folks have gotten together, looked at that location, and pre-decided that this would be a good location to either capture oil or to keep oil away from a marina or a drinking water intake, or otherwise pre-strategize what could be done if a large amount of oil is coming down the river.
Coming up next on Access Minnesota, the MPCA's Steve Lee tells us how state authorities will respond to environmental accidents.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now, more of our conversation with Steve Lee from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. If there is an oil spill in Minnesota, how does the MPCA and other agencies respond to that?
It's a truism in spill response that everybody's in charge of something and nobody's in charge of anything. So kind of the false question of who's in charge really doesn't get you anywhere. The local fire or police chief are in charge of the public safety threat from that spill. We are all working for them when there's a spill that threatens the public safety. When it comes into the recovery and the cleanup phase, the company has to do that under oversight of agencies like Pollution Control Agency or Department of Agriculture for pesticides and fertilizers. And we all work together. In the best case, we work together well because we've exercised and practiced together and done planning together. In the worst case, people don't know each other, they haven't ever worked together, they don't trust each other, and that doesn't work well at all.
Steve, in your estimation, how well prepared is the state of Minnesota to react to a major environmental calamity such as an oil spill?
In my estimation, we're far better prepared than we used to be. You're never going to be prepared for every contingency and every setback in a big spill, but I think the state of Minnesota agencies and industry are fairly well prepared and pretty nimble. It takes continued practice, it takes continued drilling. In the history of oil spill response, preparedness peaks a few years after a major incident, and then when big spills don't happen, preparedness tends to erode away as people get other priorities. So that's the challenge, is to keep the preparedness up, to learn the lessons of the Gulf, Surely there's going to be new law coming from the BP situation. Whether those laws help or hinder, time will tell.
Are there any plans in Minnesota to, say, conduct a drill to help responders prepare for the possibility of an oil spill?
Sure, there's facilities that handle oil are required to drill periodically. All of the organizations that we belong to do periodic drills. For example, next week, the organization that we belong to with the industries between St. Paul and Hastings are doing an oil spill training class. They're going to be doing an exercise in the classroom on how to respond to a significant spill, and then they're going out into the field to practice those boat and boom skills in the actual water, which very often you can exercise, you can plan on paper in the office. Getting out on that big water is a whole different thing.
Obviously, an oil spill is a huge ecological calamity, but if we're more concerned about the immediate threat to human life, when you prioritize and worry about potential environmental accidents, are you more concerned about, say, rail cars derailing and releasing a toxic chemical like anhydrous ammonia? Is that more of a real threat in terms of property and safety than an oil spill is, at least in the short term?
Yeah, for safety hazards, the mix is the material that's spilled, how much of it's spilled, and what's the surroundings. And a very serious incident would be a gasoline petroleum pipeline, or a gasoline tanker, or an anhydrous ammonia tanker overturned and leaking in a populated area. That's a public safety threat. We and everybody else are working for the fire department in that situation. We'll bring our contractors and our expertise and help to bear with the fire department, but those are very real and immediate public safety threats. Environment is something we work on at the same time, but it has to follow the public safety protection.
If there is a major environmental calamity, we rely on authorities, local governments, state governments, federal authorities sometimes, to handle and keep us safe from accidents like that. But what can ordinary Minnesotans do to mitigate the possibility of environmental accidents? Things we can do, for example, at home to avoid polluting nearby waters.
Okay, people that change their own oil can make sure that their used oil is taken to the proper recycling. People that have a garage full of old paint cans and pesticide can take those to the household hazardous waste collection projects that every county in the state is involved with. If people have a home heating oil tank in their basement, they can make sure that that home heating oil tank is well maintained, and because that in fact is some of the most heartbreaking spills we're involved with. When a home heating oil tank ruptures in a basement, fills the basement with fuel oil, that's a terrible problem for that homeowner. Are
fluorescent lights a concern?
Fluorescent lights should be handled correctly and taken to recycling. The new mercury fluorescent bulbs, actually, when you do the math on the mercury bulbs, they save enough electricity that even if you broke that bulb, there'd be less mercury released to the environment, because a regular bulb takes up so much coal and releases so much mercury to make the electricity that a mercury bulb CFL is better for the environment. Kind of an odd, anti-intuitive thing.
Steve Lee from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Okay, thank you, Jim.
Coming up next on Access Minnesota, U of M professor John Gulliver tells us what we can do to keep our waters clean and safe.